Every great story needs a great rivalry. Coke versus Pepsi. The Yankees versus the Red Sox. But before all of them, there was the OG heavyweight title fight of the ancient world, Rome versus Carthage. For over 100 years, these two superpowers were locked in a bitter, world-shaking feud. It was a clash of titans that gave us legendary generals, insane military strategies, and elephants climbing over mountains. But here's the thing about rivalries: when one side wins, they get to write the history. And Rome didn't just win, they brought a giant eraser to the party. We all know how Rome's story ends. But what was it like to be on the other side? What was it like to be in the city of Carthage in 146 BCE, when the Romans finally came to finish the job? This isn't the story of Rome's greatest victory. This is the story of their greatest enemy's last stand. Welcome to Echoes of the Fallen, where we dig up history's most fascinating failures. Buckle up for today's episode about the last days of Carthage, told from their side of the wall. Okay, quick recap for those in the back. Before the end, Carthage wasn't some backwater. It was a powerhouse. Founded by Phoenician settlers, Carthage ruled trade routes, minted money, and basically invented a Mediterranean Costco. They were so successful that Rome, still figuring out indoor plumbing, got jealous. Cue the Punic Wars, 3 rounds of the ancient world's deadliest grudge match. The first 2 Punic Wars were basically a century-long, spicy foreign policy disagreement. Carthage was the big boss of the Mediterranean, and the upstart Rome decided it wanted the title. The Second Punic War was the main event. You've heard of this one. It starred Carthage's goat, Hannibal Barca, the guy who famously marched 30,000 soldiers, 15,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants marching over the Alps into Italy to give Rome a panic attack for 15 years. That's like showing up to your neighbor's backyard barbecue with a tank division. And it worked, at first. Carthage humiliated Rome at battles like Cannae, where Hannibal basically invented the encirclement maneuver. His forces killed at least 50,000 Roman legionaries. But, spoiler alert, he eventually lost. After the Battle of Zama, Rome put Carthage in a headlock and gave them a 50-year-long noogie. The peace treaty was brutal. Carthage had to pay a fine so huge they were basically in debt until the concept of money stopped existing. They lost all their territory. And the real kicker, they weren't allowed to declare war on anyone without Rome's permission. This brings us to the 150s BCE. Carthage is finally getting back on its feet, paying off its debts, and trying to mind its own business. But their neighbor, Numidia, keeps raiding their territory, knowing Carthage can't do anything about it. Imagine someone keeps running over your mailbox, and the cop on the corner just smiles and says, "Looks like a you problem." After decades of this, Carthage finally snaps and sends an army to defend itself. And Rome, who was probably egging the Numidians on the whole time, says, "Oh, you broke the rules. Time for total annihilation." The Romans land an army in North Africa, and the Carthaginians, terrified, immediately try to surrender. They send ambassadors, hand over weapons, and basically say, "Our bad. We'll do anything, please don't hurt us." The Roman consul then delivers the final ultimatum. And it is a masterclass in unreasonable demands. He says, "Okay, we'll spare you. On one condition. You must completely abandon your city, dismantle it brick by brick, and move 10 miles inland, away from the sea." For a city of sailors and merchants whose entire identity and economy was tied to the sea, this wasn't an ultimatum. It was a death sentence with extra steps. The Carthaginian ambassadors just stood there, stunned. The Romans hadn't come for a treaty. They had come for a funeral. When the news reached the city, the despair turned to pure, unadulterated rage. They had given up their weapons, and now they were cornered. So they did what any cornered animal would do, they decided to fight to the last breath. What followed was one of the most incredible citizen-led mobilizations in history. The city of Carthage became a giant weapons factory. According to the historian Appian, public buildings were turned into workshops. Men and women worked day and night, churning out swords, shields, and catapults. In a legendary act of sacrifice, the women of Carthage cut off their long hair to be woven into ropes for the war machines. It was a citywide rocky training montage, fueled by pure defiance. They were going to make the Romans work for it. For 3 years, Carthage held out. Their massive walls were some of the best in the ancient world. Their circular military harbor, the Catapult, was a fortress. But the Romans, now led by the brilliant and ruthless Scipio Aemilianus, grandson of the general who beat Hannibal, were relentless. They built a giant mole to block the harbor entrance, trying to starve the city out. In a secret, desperate effort, the Carthaginians dug a new channel to the sea and built a new fleet in secret. They were clever. They were resilient. But it wasn't enough. In the spring of 146 BCE, the Romans finally breached the walls. But the fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. What followed was 6 straight days of brutal, street-to-street, house-to-house slaughter. This wasn't an open battlefield, this was a meat grinder, a house-to-house bloodbath. The city's narrow streets turned into death traps. The Romans had to fight for every single building, advancing from rooftop to rooftop, clearing houses filled with families who refused to surrender. They were no longer soldiers, they were exterminators. The siege resulted in the death of 62,000 Carthaginian and finally, the last 50,000 survivors, starving and broken, surrendered from the Bursa, the city's citadel. The Carthaginian commander, Hasdrubal the Carthage, surrendered to Scipio. But his wife, seeing her husband's submission, had other ideas. Standing on the roof of a burning temple, she reportedly cursed him as a coward, threw her children into the flames, and then jumped in after them. A horrifying, defiant end to a defiant city. Scipio reportedly wept as he watched the city burn, quoting a line from Homer about the fall of Troy, knowing that even Rome might one day face the same fate. Then he carried out his orders. The city was systematically demolished. The survivors were sold into slavery. The famous story says the Romans then sowed the fields with salt to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. While modern historians like Richard Miles argue this is probably a myth, a later embellishment, it speaks to the legend of Rome's intent. Carthage was not just to be defeated. It was to be erased. Rome won so completely that almost everything we know about Carthage comes from the Romans themselves, their enemies. Carthage was ghosted by history, its libraries burned, its people scattered, its voice silenced. But here's the twist, Carthage never fully died. The Romans eventually rebuilt it as a colony, and later it became one of the jewels of the Roman Empire. And Hannibal? His tactics are still studied in military academies today. Napoleon, Eisenhower, even modern generals tip their hats to the man who marched elephants over the Alps. So yes, Carthage lost, spectacularly. But their final, defiant stand is a bloody reminder that history is written by the victors. But sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of the fallen, a warning from a ghost on the shores of the Mediterranean. So the next time someone brags about Roman greatness, remember they only got there by destroying a city that once rivaled them in power, wealth, and maybe even elephants. This is Echoes of the Fallen. Thanks for joining us on this trip into the Inferno. What piece of forgotten history should we dig up next? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of the defeated, the forgotten, and the doomed, because sometimes, history's losers are way more interesting than its winners.